All right. I don't know what I did to the YouTube gods, but I think I screwed something up. So I posted this last video like 15 minutes ago. And when I rewatch it, it cuts off at like the 6 minute mark. And I don't know why. Because on my little YouTube channel thing, it says it's longer. So I'm going to try it again for those out there. And it looks like some people are trying to view it. And so if you're out there, drop a comment. Let me know if you're watching. Okay, so this whole objective versus subjective thing, and I think the YouTube gods are mad at me. They just don't want me making this video. Okay, so a couple days ago, I posted a video. Why is TI objective and TE maybe subjective? But uh, and I think it somehow got into my algorithm feed because I've been seeing a bunch of videos on what is TI um, and of course, in the videos that I've seen, I'm not naming any names because again, I don't want to pick any internet fights, but they really drive home the point that TI is this subjective thinking, and and I think it's worth sort of unpacking, especially for those of you who are sort of bouncing around from quote unquote expert to expert to expert on the YouTube. Um, and it can cause a lot of confusion. And are we talking about the same thing? And how do you reconcile it? And, is somebody wrong? Is somebody right? And I think there's a way to sort of think about it and reconcile it. And it really comes down to, if you buy into the Young description of introverted thinking, then yes, it is absolutely a subjective type of cognitive function because that's the way he was thinking about it. And that's the way he describes it. And, but I think that there is a cleaner way of thinking about TI that isn't as sort of all over the place that Young's description of it seemed to be. Again, I think he was sort of conflating some FI stuff, some NI stuff in there. But really, you have to keep in mind what Young was trying to do. And he was really just coming up with a field guide for other psychoanalysts out there. And it was basically like, hey, here are a bunch of different types of people. And here are the neuroses or psychological problems or complexes that they tend to have based off of this sort of personality type or cognitive function type, however you want to think about it, psychological type. And when he was talking about the introverted thinker, he was describing a person who is just sort of lost in their own little internal world, comes up with their own little thoughts, their own little theories. It's not really based off of objective data. And to the extent that they use objective data, it's only to the extent it sort of matches what their internal thinking model has created. And they'll sort of ignore other data that doesn't match up with the way they think about it. And it was probably a very early take or description of cognitive bias, right? What we tend to think of as cognitive bias. And these types of people that he's describing, and maybe you could characterize people like this or think of people like this. That's fine. But again, they sort of get lost in their own thought. They think they kind of come up with their own way of thinking about the world. The real world be damned. If somebody doesn't agree with them, it's because they just don't get it. That kind of person, right? We probably all met those types of people. And so you can see where he's coming from. And his description of them is, again, he's trying to connect it to a certain type of psychosis. And he describes these people as being very anxious, right? Because they build up this model that is, number one, very hard for them to articulate to the outside world the way that they think about things, because it's all internal. And it's just sort of hard in the first place to articulate your ideas, and that are sort of devoid of objective facts, or could be. And B, to the extent you can articulate it and tell people what you're thinking, they are going to tend to disagree with you because it doesn't match up with their objective view of reality, right? And so, um, and then the way that he's sort of thinking about it is, if you're not an internal introverted thinker, then you're probably an extroverted thinker, and you see it when you think of things like objective facts and the way that everybody else thinks about it, right? The way the quote unquote tribe thinks about the world. And so you become this very anxious person because of that sort of disconnect between the way other people think and the way you think. And it makes you more anxious, and it also makes you more reclusive as you get older and develop more of this introverted thinking and this introverted thinking model of the world. You sort of pull yourself away from the world and start going more inside your head, to the point to where you just sort of don't communicate with other people. And really the only people you do communicate with are sort of close people who maybe think the way that you do, or can at least see where you're coming from, right? But other than that, you kind of avoid dealing with people. And to the extent you do, it's sort of this like haughty, like, I'm smarter than everybody, and everybody just doesn't see it the way that I see it. Um, and again, ignoring any sort of data that contradicts the way that you think about the world. Now, I mean, if you describe it that way, yeah, there's plenty of people out there that are like that. Um, and yeah, I guess, it could tend to make somebody anxious in the Jungian psychoanalytical view of the world. Um, and maybe it is a useful way of describing that cognitive function. And maybe it's a useful predictive way of reading people. Like, yeah, that's the type of person who's just sort of lost in his own thought and detached from reality. And they're getting worse and worse as they get older and older. And yeah, I mean, just sort of intuitively, we know those types of people. And that is a way of thinking about psychological type. It totally fits the Jungian theory. It fits some other models that are out there. Um, and it's based off of this idea that there could be, or that some people have a quote unquote subjective logic. Um, Now, here's where I disagree. Um, well, let me back up real quick. I mean, and so if you want to have a model or a framework, personality type framework of reading people and typing people, maybe that works, and maybe it works for you, and that's great. And maybe it's sort of like how the Enneagram has its own way of describing people that doesn't necessarily match up with MBTI or cognitive functions or anything like that. But it is a useful model, and it is a useful way of sort of dealing with people and reading people. Um, and so if you want to think about TI as that, then great. Um, the problem that I have with it is, I don't think that I don't think there is such a thing as subjective logic, and I'll get into that in a second. I think logic is logic. The rules of logic are universal. If you go to another dimension or go find some aliens somewhere, and they're advanced enough and can think and all that, Their rules of logic are going to be the same as our rules of logic, right? As long as you're following the correct procedure or process, in your logical computation, then you're going to come out with the same output as they are. Just, again, as long as the input is the same, you agree on the premises, you agree on the defined terms, and it's just a matter of running it through your logical processor, then they are going to come up with the same answer as you, right? So if you go to them and say, all bananas are yellow, I'm yellow, am I a banana? They, say, well, not necessarily, right? You could be, but not necessarily, right? Formal rules of logic. Um, all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles, that kind of thing. And so, in that sense, it's objective, it's universally true. You come up with a correct answer, just like if I put in 2 plus 2 in my calculator and you put 2 plus 2 in your calculator, it, as long as it's functioning correctly, in following the rules of logic or computation, we're going to come out with the same answer. Okay. So in that sense, it's objective. Okay. And to me, and, and again, I base most of what I think on the defensible typology framework, talking with famous people, Eric's framework, because it just matches the brain data and it matches computational theory, computer science, and and I'll get into that in a second. Okay. Jung's view, though, like I said, it sort of conflates FI and NI, coming up with your own theory, and your thoughts are really just your own personal opinions. That's more FI to me. Coming up with your own theory is more NI. Um, and I get it. I'm, attacking the guy who came up with the system, and it's his domain. And maybe we'd all be better off coming up with different terminology. But here we are. So let's talk about TI being objective, in a different way of thinking about it, which again I think makes more sense in and has more predictive value in reading people and understanding how these different functions play out in somebody's personality. Also, just sort of figuring out their quote unquote type, or how the different functions are stacked. And like I said, it just matches up with the brain science data and the computational science data. So let's expand a little on it. So TI being formal logic, like if like, let's say transitive inference, A is bigger than B is bigger than C, is A bigger than C? You can use your TI to figure that out hopefully pretty easily. But there are people out there who have lesions to certain areas of their brain. Usually it's like this area of the parietal lobe, and then it also could include some frontal areas too. But they have problems with that sort of transitive inference. They might be able to get that one. That might be a little too easy. But, those types of logical problems, if P then Q, or all P's are Q's, or, but not all Q's are P's, all that kind of formal logic stuff, they have difficulty doing. And so we could sort of, and then also if you put somebody in an MRI machine and read their brain activity, you'll see the same area light up that is damaged in the folks that have TI problems. So when somebody's doing a TI with fully functioning TI and you put them in an MRI, you'll see that same brain area light up. So we have a pretty good idea of where logical processing happens, or at least sort of the network that's needed. But you could differentiate that from two other functions that are important. Number one, the FI deliberation function, right? So FI, again, is more about opinion making, ethics, what ought to be the case, what should be the case, not necessarily what is the case, and not the necessary, correct, validly true conclusion, but what's your opinion on the matter, and that's going to depend on first principles and you know what you value, and it scales up, right? To ethical decisions and but not only just ethical decisions but the ability to prioritize things, and so there's this whole other network in your brain that deals with that fi stuff, right? Assigning value to things, prioritizing things, and if you have damage to that area, you could do all the TI logic stuff, the transitive inference stuff, the P's, Q's, formal logic stuff. Again, as long as the damage is, you know, doesn't spread too wide, um, people could do that TI stuff, but they can't do the FI stuff like prioritize and things, or sort of assign value, or sort of understand ethics in that respect. Um, and if you want to read more about it or learn more about it, look at the work of Antonio Damasio. Damasio, D as in dog. Um, and he was a real expert on this stuff. I don't even know if he's still around, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, like he was the guy. And he had this whole model. Well, he had this book called Descartes' Error, which really lays out his model. And he's got a couple of other books that are also worth reading if you're into this stuff. And he makes the point that people with damage to these, what I'm going to call FI areas, he doesn't use this terminology, but you get it. He could show that, they could do this logical reasoning stuff, but they have a problem with other sort of what he terms as rational behavior, like being able to make a decision, right? There's a case he talks about where it was like an executive that would just hem and haw on, on hiring somebody or some sort of decision he had to make for his business, because he couldn't prioritize. He couldn't figure out, okay, what do I value here? If I want to make a hire, what criteria do I use? What's more important than the other thing, right? Is it where the person went to college, what their major was, what their GPA was, all the stuff that we sort of factor in to making a decision. People with, quote unquote, FI damage, again, he didn't call it that, but it's what I'll call it, damage to their FI system, have a real hard time making decisions like that, right? Because it's this deliberation process. Do I hire this person or do I not hire this person, right? Now, we might think of that as a very logical, rational, devoid of emotion kind of decision, right? You know, he's not trying to say that you make those decisions purely on emotion, but you do use your FI to assign value to things, to decide, what's important, given, this decision that I have to make, right? So it's not pure logic, it's FI. Going back to Jung, he'd probably call that introverted thinking. Like, what do you think about the situation? What kind of outcome or decision would you make, as opposed to what everybody else would make? And so I could see how people sort of conflate the two. The FI-TI deliberation making, if you just think about it in the way that Jung described introverted thinking, because he would probably lump those things together. But you could see pretty clearly in the brain data and MRI data and all that kind of stuff that they are two separate brain areas doing separate things. And the FI decision making, I would argue, is more subjective. Like, what criteria do you care about? Do you care about where somebody went to law school or business school when making a hiring decision, or do you care about their GPA? Or maybe you put more weight on, prior work experience or, their social background, like all those sorts of things you can factor into making a decision. But all those criteria are your opinion, like what's important, for a candidate. And once you've developed that criteria, then maybe it's sort of a easy, you know, formal process to make a decision. But you still have to use that FI, um, introverted feeling to come up with the criteria in the first place. And again, people with damage to this area have a really hard time coming up with decisions like that because they can't prioritize what's important and what's not. Okay. It's not just a P then Q kind of system to them. Okay. So that's differentiating TI from FI. And I think a lot of people, when they're describing introverted thinking in these typology videos or models, they're conflating those two. They're conflating FI deliberation with TI deliberation because it's sort of like I'm making a decision, I'm on my own internal logic. And it's not really internal logic, it's your internal set of criteria that you've developed. And that's FI, that's not TI, okay? Um, and if you think about it that way, everything starts making a lot more sense to me. It's just a lot clearer. Um, and it's sort of the same, and you can sort of tease this apart in AI a little bit. AI is very good at logical reasoning, or it's gotten a lot better. Um, and the FI stuff, it will sort of use rules of thumb, but you can tell it doesn't, the AI model isn't really coming up with its own real criteria. It's just sort of using criteria that it sees other people using out in the world and sort of building its FI quote unquote decision making off of that. So that might be another video, another story for another time. So that's the first thing to tease apart, this FI versus TI. And FI is the opinion builder, the what ought you do, what should you do, given certain criteria that you feel are important, and making a decision based off of that, versus TI, which is just pure logic processing that a computer or a calculator could do. Okay. And the other thing is, you know, you can have 10 different executives making a hiring decision, and they might all come up with 10 different answers or 10 different conclusions. They might hire, you know, 10 different people, because they have different criteria, right? And to what's important to them. And so, obviously there could be some overlap, but you get the point. And so in that sense, it's subjective, right? They're coming up with their own criteria and making their decision based off of a subjective set of criteria. A TI decision, everybody's going to come up with the same answer because it's a universally logically valid conclusion, right? As long as everybody agrees on the input, and as long as everybody agrees on the rules of logic and they are objectively true, so everybody should be agreeing on them, and there's no slippage in the system, no heuristics or logical fallacies or anything like that, as long as you follow the rules, everybody's gonna come up with the same answer, just like everybody's calculator comes up with the same answer when you put in 2 plus 2. Okay? So, in that sense, it's objective. Okay? And again, that's not the way Jung thought about it, and it's not the way that a lot of other sort of typology people think about it, and I will fully admit that. But I think that that's just sort of a clunky way of thinking about it. It doesn't really match up with the way the brain really works and the way to me, it makes it harder to have any sort of predictive value of whether somebody's a TI user or an FI user. I think if you see TI as focusing on getting the correct answer, the validly correct answer, and noticing patterns in people's behavior where even if they're asked an FI question, they focus on sort of a TI response. Like, what's the correct answer? What would everybody agree is a good answer, even though it's an FI question, right? Go watch my video on Zendaya. It's the perfect example because she keeps asking the interviewer, she's getting a bunch of FI questions, and she keeps asking the interviewer, is that a good answer? Does that sound right? And then just gets really frustrated because, again, I think she was not focusing on FI responses, but on TI responses. She wanted answers that sounded good, and in that sense, correct, right? And so you could see why the TI FE axis sort of has that, like, wants to give an answer that everybody agrees to, and it kind of comes across as FE. Like, I want everybody, it's perception management. I want everybody to think that I'm right. I don't want to come across as dumb. But it's also got this TI part of it. I want to be correct. I want to have an answer that everybody agrees is a correct answer, even though it's an FI question and FI users are like, hey, I'm just going to tell you what I think, or what I quote unquote feel is the correct answer. And I don't care if anybody agrees with me. It's what I feel. And I will explain to you why I feel that way. But I really don't care if you feel that way, because, you asked me my opinion, and here it is. TI users don't really think like that, or front stack TI. They're more concentrated on, can I justify this answer? Is it correct in some sort of universal way, defensible way? Okay. So so that's parsing out the introverted sort of decision-making deliberation, where if somebody wants to say that somebody's TI is subjective, really try to parse it out and see if they're really talking about FI, making an FI decision. Okay. Then the other thing to sort of tease apart is TI and TE. And here is kind of the way that I would think about it. If you're really hung up on the introverted versus extroverted part of it, like, how do I explain this? How do I explain TE as being extroverted and TI as being introverted? Here's the way that I would think about it. If you're using TI, you could be anywhere in the world and under any circumstances, at any time, any date, any place, any context. If you have a TI problem and you're following the rules of logic and you have correct, input, you are going to come up with the same answer no matter what. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is. It doesn't matter what time it is. It doesn't matter what where place you're at, or what objects are out in the universe. You could be in a completely different dimension, a completely different universe. You're still going to come up with the same answer. So in that respect, it's all in your head, right? It's all internal computation, because the outside world doesn't matter, other than providing you the input that you're processing, right? The question that you're trying to answer, and sort of the knowledge base that you're using to come up with the answer. Once you have all that information, then sending it through your little logical processor, that's all internal. It doesn't matter. None of the external stuff matters. It doesn't matter. Context doesn't matter. Okay. It's either validly true or it's not validly true. So if I ask you something like, all bananas are yellow, this cup is yellow, is this cup necessarily a banana? It doesn't matter what the context is. It doesn't matter, it's all symbolic logic, right? I could have said, all bananas are green. This cup is green. Is this cup necessarily a banana? It's the same rules of logic. The outside facts don't matter, other than just sort of providing you the input to run through your processor. Okay. So in that respect, it's quote unquote internal, not subjective, but it's internal. It's in your head. And the outside world doesn't matter. TE, on the other hand, is very dependent on what's going on in the outside world. It's very context dependent. It depends a lot on the objects out there in the world and the conditions of the world, the real world. So let's take my favorite TE example. Give me directions from my apartment to my office, and that is a TI problem space. That's a TI problem to solve. How do I get from point A to point B? And clearly, the outside world matters. The conditions of the outside world matters. Like, what streets are there? Am I taking a car? Am I walking? Am I riding a bike? Am I taking a helicopter? Am I taking a boat? All that stuff matters and is going to shape your your plan of action, your routine that you're building with your TE. And if the conditions change, then your answer changes, right? If the conditions of the world change, like, oh, this highway is shut down, or oh, this highway has a bunch of traffic, or there's construction on this street, I would avoid at all costs. You're going to change your routine because the conditions of the world changed, right? And TI planning is going to depend on that kind of stuff. Okay. So context matters, the conditions of the world, the constraints that you have to navigate through all matter. Okay. And you and I could come up with different pathways to get from my apartment to my office, and they both solve the TE problem, right? Mine, I might prefer mine over yours, and you might prefer yours over mine, but that's an FI thing. You know, you might prefer getting there faster. I might prefer, you know, avoiding the highway. I don't like to drive on the highway, so I want to take back streets or something like that, right? Or I might be walking and you might be driving, right? And so we might take very different paths depending on, the constraints of the world and what we prioritize, things like that. So in that respect, I'd like to say it's quote unquote subjective because we can come up with our own conclusions, but it does have some objective, truth to it too. You're either going to get there or you're not. And so it's not purely subjective, but to the extent, we have preferences, things like that, you can think of it as subjective. But I wouldn't really get too bogged down on this objective versus subjective stuff. If you're going to follow the Jungian model and use that as your framework, then fine. You can think of it as subjective versus objective. And you kind of have to sort of get his point of what he's making. But it doesn't map out to what we know about how the brain works in computational theory, like how computation works. It's too garbled. And so that's why it's so confusing. And trust me, I started off, 20 years ago listening to, people try to tease apart TI and TE in that manner. It's, what other people think versus what you think. And it made no sense to me. Like, I couldn't make heads or tails out of it, until I started thinking about it the way that the defensible typology model thinks about it, is it's either internal or logic, symbolic logic, formal logic versus planning, planning out behaviors. And then everything just makes more sense. And you can really see TE types because they're focused on process. They're focused on, doing it this way, do this, then this, then this, then this, then this. They are process junkies. And I think another a good example is watch Shane Starr's videos, and his approach to typology versus mine or Eric's. Eric and I are both introverted thinkers at some level, and Shane is clearly an extroverted thinker, probably an ISTJ. And he is very focused on, like, what's the use of all this stuff. um he doesn't get bogged down on definitions or deliberating, teasing things apart in this sort of TI way. He's more concerned about, does this stuff have any value? Does it have any sort of practical value? Is there some way that I can use this to improve my process, right? My process of growing as a person or self actualization, very, very process pragmatic oriented. And again, it's a very TE approach. There's obviously, no approach is better or worse. It's just that's sort of the filter he's running it through, right? And you could see it in other people out there in typology world, who are very process oriented, who are just sort of like, oh, you do this and then you do that and then you do this, then you'll be a superstar, with your cognitive functions. And that's again a very TE sort of approach. And they tend to appeal to authority, like, well, this is what Jung said, or this is what so and so said, and they're the authority on it. So I'm going to go with what they said, and then apply it, as opposed to the TI folks who swoop down into the comments and tell you how wrong you are, and not because they're appealing to authority, but because they have a different framework that they might have built up with their TI, or you use the wrong word for something. It's very TI, and I do it too. So I fully admit to it. Okay, and then of course in the TI versus TE distinction, you also see that in the brain data, right? You can have people with frontal lobe damage, and we call it a deficit in executive function, where they have a real hard time planning things out, and doing that sort of TE stuff. They tend to be very impulsive. They can't sort of control themselves. Like the classic example is you take a frontal lobe patient and put them in front of a computer, and they just immediately just start typing on it, right? Because they have this sort of stimulus response sort of thing, and they don't have the frontal lobe sort of filtering out, or we call it inhibition, inhibiting behavior, that you need to be able to plan things out and sort of organize in an ordinal way. But they could do all the logic stuff. They could do the TI stuff. They could do math problems. They could do transitive inference problems. They could do if P then Q formal logic problems. Again, as long as the damage is not too extensive, because frontal lobe is somewhat involved with TI stuff too, so might be hard to tease apart sometimes. But you can see it. The TE is by far more impaired than the TI in these patients, if you give them simple enough TI stuff to do. And they don't have to sort of plan out a course of action to solve the problem. Okay, so and again, you see in MRI data and all that too, these TE parts versus TI parts. And so in that respect, and then it also matches up with the computational theory, right? Computers have to do different types of processing. And you see it in the AI distinction, where ChatGPT and the other LLM models can do the sort of TI reasoning, and they're getting much better at it than they used to be. And they're doing sort of formal logic problems, and it's not just sort of based off of scraping data and just parroting back what some response that they sort of gathered from some other source. It's like the AI models are actually doing the reasoning, and figuring out the answer, or so they say. And I, no reason not to believe them. But that's very different than making an ice cream cone or driving a driverless car. It's a different problem space and it's a different computational space. And so you need a different computational model to do that. And I forget what they call it. It's like learned action model, something like that, where like you just sort of put robots out in the world and then it's still machine learning, it's still neural networking and all that, but they're learning by interacting with the world, right? And then they sort of learn planned behavior. And then, and it's sort of getting to the point where it's not just programming them how to make an ice cream cone or how to drive, but they're actually learning how to adapt and plan. If this constraint comes up, then I do this. For example, a self-driving car, if it hits a street that is under construction and it didn't know, quote unquote, that there was construction going on, it has to reroute and come up with a new plan. That's very sophisticated and that's very TE. It's not an LLM, it's not a TI solving problem. It's a TE solving problem. How do I plan to get from point A to point B, given the constraints of the world that are out there and navigating through those constraints. And so again, when you think about it, just these three functions in that way, it becomes so much easier to read people in this sort of predictive way, whether they're using TE or TI. Are they process oriented or are they focused on being correct? An FI user, front stack FI user, they don't have a problem sharing their opinion or their FI deliberation. I'd invite you go watch the video that Shane Starr and I did, where we both did these sort of Proust FI questions, and Shane had zero problem. Even third slot FI had zero problem coming up with an FI answer to an FI question. Very, very little resistance. It seemed, pretty effortlessly. He could come up with an answer where my responses were a little like, sort of thinking it through. And I will tell you, from firsthand experience or from what my personal experience was, is I was trying to come up with a quote unquote correct answer. And it wasn't just because that's my little pet theory. It's like, that's really how I felt, what I was doing was trying to come up with an answer that I could defend, right? That everybody would kind of see it as being, a quality answer, even if they might not come up with the same answer as I would. So I wasn't trying to come up with an answer that everybody would come up with, but just something that I could defend, logically, as opposed to Shane or any other sort of, front stack FI user. It's just easier for them to just say, this is what I think, this is my opinion, and without feeling the need to justify it. They might elaborate on it because they kind of want you to see where they're coming from, but it's not really trying to justify it. It's just sort of elaborating because it's sort of an interesting thing to talk about or something. Okay. So that's that. I'd be interested in your comments, and if thinking about TI, TE, and FI this way makes it easier. Does it make sense? Or maybe I am just like what Jung would describe as an introverted thinker and just coming up with my own theory and just saying whatever everybody else says, don't listen to them, and ignoring like real world data. But I know the young Data is out there, that, and he is the authority, and I know he thought about it very differently. And the people who sort of, you know, went through that sort of line of thinking, probably think about it in the same way. And that's fine. Again, as long as it gives them some predictive value and some use in reading people, dealing with people, understanding themselves, then, who am I to say that, one way is better than the other? It's just, to me, you know, pumping that little TI machine and NI machine. Um, I just think that thinking about it the way that I just described it just makes a lot more sense, and is sort of easier to reconcile with the data that's out there and how people act. But again, maybe that's just me. And Jung would call me an introverted thinker, just thinking of my own little theories. All right. If anybody's out there, say hello. But otherwise, I am taking off. So have a good night. Bye.